So the purpose of this video is going to be to give you an overall introduction to the discipline of philosophy, give you a sense of the kinds of questions we'll be looking at in this class, and perhaps more importantly, give you a sense of the attitude or the approach you should take in looking at these questions. And more specifically, there are really three questions that I want to ask about philosophy, or that someone who's approaching philosophy for the first time would naturally want to know. So the first question that you might ask is, okay, well, I'm studying philosophy for the first time. What is philosophy? What is it that makes the questions that philosophers talk about philosophical? What qualifies as a philosophical question? And here you're asking a question about the nature of philosophy. What is the discipline itself? So we'll have a few things to say about that in this video. Secondly, once we have some sense of what philosophers do, of what philosophy is, we might also ask the question, okay, well, how do philosophers go about their work? What is the method that philosophers use? Philosophers ask a certain kind of question. How do they go about providing an answer to that question? So you might want to know about the method of philosophy. And I'll say also a few things in this video about that, although most of my more technical comments about the method of philosophy will be reserved for the next video in this lesson. And then finally, once you have a sense of what philosophy is and how philosophers go about doing whatever it is that they do, you might want to sort of ask a question about what is the value of philosophy, because as I hope you're going to see as we move throughout this course, many of the questions philosophers talk about are abstract, they're difficult, they'll challenge you. They'll challenge you to think in ways that you might not naturally think. They'll challenge you to look at certain questions from different perspectives. And in any case, philosophical questions just are hard. And any time you undergo a sort of hard, arduous labor, you might say, well, what is the payoff? Why is it that I should invest time in looking at these questions? And so it's extremely important, it's worth asking, what is the value of philosophy itself? And in the third video for this lesson, we're going to look specifically at that question. What is going to be the payoff? Why study philosophy? Especially because it just is the case that for many philosophical questions, the more you ask about the questions, the more you think about the questions, the less certain you might become about the answer. And so one of the things we'll really have to think about is, what is the value of living with uncertainty? What is the value of pursuing questions which you may never confidently arrive at an answer you're completely comfortable with or arrive at consensus? Okay, so that's a broad outline of the questions I'm going to look at in this lesson. Let's begin with the first one, the nature of philosophy. What is philosophy? Now, here's where you're probably going to be disappointed, because if you're studying philosophy for the first time, if this is your first encounter with philosophy, then it would be completely expected, completely natural. You might think I, as the instructor, owe you an answer to the question, what is philosophy? A definition that you could state in maybe one or two sentences. And I agree with you, it would be great to provide that sort of definition. Unfortunately, I'm not going to do that here. And the reason may again be something you find disappointing. Part of the reason I'm not going to give you that definition is because I myself don't have a good definition. Now, I certainly know the sorts of questions that philosophers look at, and I'm going to give you some examples of those in a moment. But I don't have a really good definition for why these questions are considered philosophical. I have a general shape of what it is that characterizes philosophical questions. But it's actually rather hard to determine just what is philosophy and what separates it from other disciplines. In fact, philosophers to this day still argue about that question themselves. So I think a more productive route is to take a look at some examples of philosophical questions and invite you to think more about what do you think it is that characterizes or unites or makes these questions similar. And so I have some examples here, and in fact, we are going to, at various times in this course, look at each of these questions. Now, these are not the only philosophical questions. There are many philosophical questions besides these 7 that I have listed here. but we're going to look at all of them in this course, and they give you a good idea of the sorts of things philosophers worry about. So number one, does God exist? Right? A classic philosophical question. Is there a all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being that is the origin of the universe, or is there not? What is the meaning of life? What ought we be doing with our life? What is the purpose of our actions? What are those highest goods we should be pursuing? Do the things we do matter, or at bottom, is everything just meaningless? Does it matter whether we succeed in what we're trying to do with our lives? Should we fear our own death? Now, naturally, you might think, well, death seems to be the most fearsome thing I can think about. The very thought of not existing is not only strange, but it's really disquieting. To think about the idea of, well, here I am, a conscious being, engaging in various activities, and someday I won't be that thing. So should we fear death? And of course that relies on another question we'll look at in this course. Is our death bad for us? Because some philosophers have said, despite our common intuition, that actually our death isn't even a bad thing. Do human beings have free will? Are we the sorts of beings that make rational, autonomous choices, who decide among various alternatives, are in our control of our destinies? Or are we sort of like machines that take in inputs from our past? Right? Does our past and what's going on, around us, the way we were raised, the way our genetics and biology is set up, do all those things determine what we will do next? Do we have free choice over our lives, or are we lacking in free will? What defines our personal identity over time? What is it that makes you who you are? What is it that made you the same person now that you were a week ago, 10 minutes ago? What will make you the same person 10 minutes into the future, a week into the future? And for that matter, what would it mean that you could possibly survive your own death? Many religious traditions have an idea of an afterlife, of surviving your bodily death. How could it be that you now are the same individual as whatever it is that survives your bodily death? This really just is a question about what makes you who you are. What is the source of moral goodness and badness? We all understand that there are ideas that we shouldn't lie, we shouldn't harm other people, we should give to charity, and be a helpful and benevolent person. Well, why? Why do we say some actions are good and some are bad? Where do those ideas come from? What is the source of political authority? We recognize that there are laws, there's a government, and there's an idea that we should follow them. Well, why? And should we always follow the law? What is it that gives the government the authority to command us to do or not do certain things? Now, when you look at this list of questions, one thing that should strike you is just the sheer number of different topics that philosophers will tackle. There's actually a great deal of distance between the question, does God exist, and what is the source of political authority? The question of does God exist will have you asking questions about where did the universe come from, what is the origin of the cosmos, is there an overall order and structure to the universe? A question about what is the source of political authority will have you asking, well, what is it that makes these specific people we've deemed legislators or politicians in the executive branch, what is it that makes these specific individuals have an authority that I should obey? One about the nature of the universe, one about politics. These are two very vastly different topic areas. Yet philosophers look at both of these questions, and sometimes the same philosopher will have something to say about both of them. So one thing to think about is that when we're trying to think about what is it that makes some question philosophical, it's not that philosophers have some specific sort of topic area or area of human life in mind. Right, whereas the economist studies, economic life of human beings, psychologist studies our mental life, a physicist studies the way in which natural bodies move in the universe. Philosophers will study a wide variety of different topics. So what is it that makes these questions all united? Again, I can't give you a perfect definition here, but one thing to notice is that these are some of the most fundamental questions that a person can ask. And what I mean by that is they're some of the most fundamental questions that a reflective person, someone who's thinking carefully and who has time to engage in careful reflection, can ask. They're some of the deepest questions. Think about the question, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of everything, of all our actions, of everything we're doing? Now, in your ordinary day-to-day affairs, this isn't really a question that's going to occur to you. You know, your alarm goes off at whatever time you get up, you have breakfast, you say, okay, what things I got to do today? Oh, I got to watch this philosophy lecture, maybe I have to run to the store, oh, I was going to call a friend, I have to go to work later today, whatever it is you're planning on doing that day. When you're just focused on the minutiae, the details, the to-do list you have for that day, you're not really usually engaged in thinking about these larger questions. Usually when we act and we perform various activities throughout the day, we're not thinking about the question, well, why does this activity matter? When you say, okay, I've got to go to the store, you don't even get to the point of thinking about, well, why do I have to go to the store? Because I'm hungry, right? I need food. You actually don't even get that far. You usually just do it on habit. Every week I go to the store. So one thing that makes a philosophical question philosophical, it's not just focused on some concrete problem. It's focused on thinking about the fundamental principles that underlie our actions, how we organize ourselves in society, and even the organization of the entire universe. Philosophers don't just ask, well, why should I go to the store? They ask, why should I do anything at all? What is the meaning of life in the first place? Philosophers don't just ask, what is the right decision for me to make here? They say, am I really making a decision at all? Do I even have free will? Right, so the one characteristic I would give you for now that really separates a philosophical question is the extent to which philosophers ask about deep, fundamental questions that underlie a lot of our normal, everyday activities and ways of thinking. Again, not really a satisfactory definition, but I hope as we go through the course, you'll get a better sense of just what it is the philosophers do, and hopefully by the end, you'll be able to give a little better definition than we have given thus far. Okay. Now, like I said, in the second video of this lesson, I'm going to say more about the technical points of the method of philosophy. But I want to say just a few things here that you should really keep in mind as we go throughout the rest of the course. So again, this question about the method of philosophy, we have all these examples of questions that philosophers look at. Does God exist? What's the meaning of life? Should we fear death? Etc. So how do philosophers go about answering those questions? What is their method? Now, as we will learn in the next video, the method of philosophy is argument, or rational argument. And what do I mean by that? Well, without giving a super technical definition for the moment, you can just think of an argument as a process of giving reasons for someone to believe that something is true. You say, let's say we're thinking about the question, does God exist? And you want to argue, yes, God does exist. If you're giving an argument, you would say, here are the reasons why. Reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. Now, we should actually pause there for a moment because that in itself is significant. The first thing to say about philosophy is that no matter what question we're looking at, and here we'll just take the example of does God exist? Whenever we're trying to answer that question, it is not enough to simply say, well, this is what I believe on that question because I was raised to believe that, or I enjoy believing that, or it's the common sense of my community or my society or the country where I live. In philosophy, we only accept as legitimate an answer to a question if it is backed up by reason. That means you have to give reasons for and evidence for why this thing is true. It's not enough to just believe it because, It feels good to believe it. It's not enough to believe it because, again, you've been taught to believe it. Philosophy is about giving reasons for the conclusion that you're trying to demonstrate. And we'll see more what that process looks like. But before we get there, we should back up and say, well, let's say you were having a debate or argument with someone about this question, does God exist? And you may have actually had such an experience in your life. You may have, I'm sure you've at some point had an argument or a discussion with someone about some question. And here's one thing I want to invite you to do, whether it's about a philosophical question or just any other question in your life. Whenever you're engaging in an argument with someone, ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? Why am I engaging in a discussion with this person on this topic? What do I hope to get out of it? What is the point? And I want to suggest to you that there are sort of two approaches you could take if you were having this debate with someone over whether God exists. There are two approaches you could take. There are two reasons you could be getting into this argument. One, you could say, you know what, my purpose is simply to win the argument. All I care about is winning. And what does winning mean? We'll say winning means maybe you convince the other person you're right, or maybe there's an audience who's watching you two discuss this and you want to convince them you're right. You want to look good in comparison to the other person. So that's one approach. That's one purpose you could have in engaging an argument. But there's also another one. You might say, well, no, the purpose of engaging an argument is to pursue the truth. Right, the reason I'm engaging in this discussion isn't necessarily to show that I'm right or the other person's wrong, or vice versa. It's to discover the truth, or at least get us closer to the truth on this question. And what I want to suggest is that the attitude or mindset that you take, whether it's the first one or the second one, winning the argument or pursuing the truth, the attitude or mindset you take makes all the difference when it comes to engaging in a philosophical argument. And to make this point, I want to consider an analogy with an athletic competition. So suppose you are playing basketball one-on-one against another person. And you could ask a similar question, why am I playing this game? And let's just put aside, you might just do it for fun, but let's just put that aside. Let's consider two possibilities about why you're playing one-on-one with this person. One, you want to win. The only reason you're doing this is because you want to win the game. Okay, now, suppose that were the case. The only reason you're engaging in this athletic competition is to be the winner. Well, if winning is all that matters, then it doesn't really matter how you play the game. You know, you could cheat. You could break the rules in a way you know you can get away with. Maybe you could even injure your opponent. Right here I have in mind, there was a famous case a number of years ago where the figure skater Tanya Harding essentially used her ex-husband to injure her opponent Nancy Kerrigan, and as a result was permanently banned from the sport. Now you might say, well, look, that was not such a great plan because you got caught. But suppose she knew she wasn't going to get caught. If really all that mattered was beating your opponent, then yeah, why not injure them? Why not tell the person you're going to play one-on-one basketball with to the wrong time and location of the game so they don't show up and then you win by default? If all that matters is winning, then it doesn't really matter what means you use to win. It just matters that you win. But on the other hand, you might take a different approach. You might say, you know what, the reason I'm playing this game, this one-on-one game of basketball, is not just to win. I mean, I'd like to win, that'd be great, but there's a higher value I have in mind. And maybe that would be something like athletic excellence. Above me personally winning, what I would like to achieve is for us both to get better. For us to become more excellent athletes, more excellent basketball players. And if that's your goal, well, you're not going to injure your opponent. You're not going to cheat. Because if you cheat to win, then you're not really playing the game as the rules outline. So you're not really getting better at basketball. If you injure your opponent, then you might win, but they didn't really challenge you. They weren't at their top of their game. And if what you really want to do is become athletically excellent, then yeah, of course you want your opponent to be at their very best. That's the only way they're going to be able to challenge you. And so the reason I bring this up is because you could say the same thing about philosophical argument. You could say, if all you really care about is winning the argument, there are rhetorical tricks, there are logical fallacies you can use that can be very convincing to an audience and make you look very good. I can list any number of these, but here's just one example. There's a fallacy known as the ad hominem fallacy. It's where you attack the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. So someone says, well, I think God exists, and here's my argument. And you say, look, everyone, we shouldn't listen to this person because this individual is morally corrupt. They're a known liar. Or you say some other fact about the person, him or herself. Well, that might be true, but again, this isn't about the personal characteristics of you or the person you're arguing against. It should be about the ideas. It should be about the argument, which is trying to come closer to an answer to the question, does God exist? So if all you care about is winning the argument, then yeah, you'd use cheap rhetorical tricks. You would metaphorically injure your opponent by using the ad hominem fallacy. You would just try to win and look good by any means necessary. On the other hand, if that's your approach, we haven't really gotten any closer to the truth. You might look better in front of a crowd, but are your points really stronger? Have we really gained knowledge as to whether God exists or not? Not necessarily. On the other hand, imagine your goal is to pursue the truth. You don't care, if your goal really is to pursue the truth, then you shouldn't be concerned with whether you're right or the other person's right. It might be nice if you're shown correct, but that's not really what matters. What matters is finding out the truth. And if that means, and so first of all, that would mean you'd want to encounter your opponent in their strongest position possible. You don't want to use cheap rhetorical tricks or bad argumentation. You want both of you to bring your strongest points to bear. And the idea is through that contest of ideas, we'll get closer to the truth on this question. And what I want to suggest to you is this idea of pursuing the truth is the attitude you should take in this class when thinking about a philosophical question. And the last point I want to make is that this is not at all an easy thing to do. Because let's take seriously for a moment. Let's say you say, okay, my goal in this discussion about the existence of God is to pursue the truth and find the truth. Okay. Now let's say that your initial position, the argument you're making, is shown by your opponent to be bad. And so you, so to speak, lose the argument. Now, if your goal is to pursue the truth, how should you feel about the fact that you just lost the argument? How should that make you feel? And how does that make most people feel most of the time? Think about a time when you were in an argument with a friend, a significant other, a parent, a coworker. And imagine a time, if this has ever happened to you, in which you were shown to be wrong. How did that make you feel? It's quite likely, if you're a normal human being, that you experience feelings of embarrassment, maybe resentment, maybe a sort of desire to find a way to show the other person to be wrong in an underhanded way somehow. Right, but in any case, it's an entirely natural human reaction to when you're shown to be wrong to become defensive and to see this as a bad thing for you. And I bring this up because this is precisely the attitude, as far as possible, that you should try not to have. And to make this point, this is a quote from famous ancient philosopher Plato, who we will be discussing a great deal of in this class, specifically the first half of this class. So I'm not going to say much about Plato now, but I just want to read this quote. He's just talking about his sort of attitude to engaging in philosophical discussion. So here's what Plato says. "And what kind of man am I? One of those who would be pleased to be refuted if I say anything untrue, and who would be pleased to refute anyone who says anything untrue. One who, however, wouldn't be any less pleased to be refuted than to refute. Now notice what he's saying here. He's saying he would prefer to be shown to be wrong than to show the other person is wrong. He would prefer to lose the argument than win the argument. Well, that's very strange. And why does he think this? Well, let's continue. He says, "For I count being refuted a greater good, insofar as it is a greater good for oneself to be delivered from the worst thing there is, than to deliver someone else from it. I don't suppose there's anything quite so bad for a person as having a false belief about the things we're discussing now." So for Plato, the worst condition someone can be in is ignorance, is lacking knowledge, is thinking you know things you don't actually know. And so if you're in a discussion with someone and they show you to be wrong, well, Plato says you've received a great benefit. You previously had a false belief, but now you don't anymore. You've been cured. You've been cured of your illness, of your sickness, of ignorance. And so he says the greatest good you can experience is to be relieved of that ignorance by someone showing you how you're wrong and correcting your beliefs. Now, I would suggest this is exactly the sort of attitude you should attempt to take when examining a philosophical question. But what I want you to think about is, why is that so difficult? Why is it so rare? Why is it so rare that people take that attitude toward being shown being wrong? And one thing I want to suggest is because, to a large extent, human beings have a tendency to make their beliefs a part of their identity. So think about the various moral, political, religious beliefs you have. Many of those might be very much a part of your identity and who you are. And those moral, political, and religious beliefs might also signify your membership in a group or a community. Religious beliefs obviously do this. Political beliefs do this by dividing us into political parties or political ideologies. And so one reason it's very uncomfortable to admit you're wrong is because sometimes it feels like you're giving up a part of who you are. It feels like you're going against the group toward which you claim membership. And so it's entirely natural to feel resistant when you feel you believe something to be false, when you're shown to be wrong. But I think the thing we need to keep in mind here is that although this is natural, it is very much an impediment. It prevents us from finding the truth in philosophical discussions. And for that reason, one thing you should very much focus on is telling yourself that the discussions we have in this class, or any other rational discussion, is not about you as a person. It's about the ideas, it's about the truth. And if you take that idea seriously, you'll be better able to contribute to the philosophical discussions and ideas that we hope to have in this class. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.